Thank you, Pastor Sean. Survival of the fittest, because he survives in Trudeau's Canada. In fact, he thrives in Trudeau's Canada, doesn't he? All right, now we know that truth exists. We know that God exists. We know that miracles are possible. The greatest miracle has already occurred. Now the question is there enough evidence that the New Testament is telling us the truth about one event from the ancient world, and that is the resurrection of Jesus? And here's what we need to point out from the beginning, just so people know. A lot of people say, well, you're using the Bible to prove the Bible. That, not even historians who are atheists believe that, okay? Because when we're approaching the Bible from a historical perspective, we're not assuming it's true or inspired. We simply want to see if those documents bear evidence of the historical events of which they speak. And historians use a lot of different ways of discovering whether or not these documents are telling us the truth, that the New Testament writers are telling the truth. In the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, there's a chapter called The Top 10 Reasons We Know the New Testament Writers Are Telling the Truth. We don't have time to go through 10. I'm going to list right here 8 of them, and I'm just going to briefly mention them. We're just going to cover 2 of them. The first one we're going to cover is called embarrassing testimony. But let me just give you a highlight of the others. Early sources. What this means is the New Testament documents were written early within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, and the material in those documents actually predates the writing. For example, there has been more than 40 creeds found in the New Testament. These were things memorized, sayings memorized about events that occurred that later found their way into the documents. The most famous of which, you can look it up on your own, is 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 7. That is an ancient creed that even atheist scholars admit goes all the way back to nearly the crucifixion and resurrection itself. Paul just wrote it in 55 AD when he wrote 1 Corinthians, but that creed, that saying, had been circulating since the very beginning. Eyewitness details. There are scores of eyewitness details in the text that only an eyewitness would know. For example, in the Gospel of Luke, there are several eyewitness details that we know only an eyewitness would know. And the other book that he wrote, the book of Acts, from chapter 13 to the end of the book, chapter 28, there are 84 details that only an eyewitness would know. And they're all listed in I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. These people were there, in other words. I'll talk about embarrassing stories in a minute. I'll also talk about excruciating deaths. Embedded confirmation. This is hard to describe in a short period of time, but this is probably the best evidence you've never heard of that shows you that the people writing these accounts down were witnessing the same event. And I call it embedded confirmation, but you'll find it on the internet by the name undesigned coincidences. Undesigned coincidences. There are entire books written on this, which show that 2 different authors are witnessing the same event, yet they're not copying from one another. So check that out. Expected predictions, that deals with Old Testament prophecy. If I only had one Old Testament prophecy to make my case on, it would be Isaiah chapter 53. We know that predated Christ by at least a couple of hundred years because it's probably the greatest of the Dead Sea Scrolls found. The entire book of Isaiah, 24-foot long scroll, includes the entire book of Isaiah and Isaiah 53, which includes Isaiah 53. And that Isaiah 53 prophecy really seems like it's talking about Jesus well in advance of him coming. That's just one of many. There's extra biblical writers. There are at least 10 ancient non-Christian sources within 150 years of Jesus' life. Household names like Josephus, Suetonius, Thallus, Phlegon. You know, you're probably reading about these people earlier in your devotions. And their brief references when you put their brief references to Jesus and the disciples and what happened, you get a story congruent with the New Testament. Now, they don't say that Jesus rose from the dead. What they say is the disciples believed Jesus rose from the dead and were willing to die for this belief. If they said Jesus rose from the dead, they would be Christians, right? They're not Christians, but they're admitting what the Christians believe. And of course, the explosive growth of the church out of Jerusalem. This is really hard to explain on an empirical claim that Jesus had risen from the dead. How could Christianity have been squashed immediately? What could they have done to say Christianity's false? Anyone? They could have taken the body out of the tomb and said, he's dead. Stop all this nonsense talk about the resurrection. They couldn't do that. Why? Because Jesus was still using his body. All right? It had resurrected from the dead. Why didn't they squash Christianity? Why did they come up with an excuse that the disciples came and stole the body while the guards were asleep? Why did they say that? Because the tomb was empty. By the way, that's a very bad explanation. The disciples came and stole the body while the guards were asleep. First of all, what motive would the disciples have to steal a body? To get themselves beaten, tortured, and killed? That doesn't make any sense. And by the way, if you're asleep, how do you know what happened? We were asleep, see? And while we were sleeping, we noticed these disciples came here and took the body right from under our noses. Now, that doesn't make any sense. No, Christianity could have been stopped by the Jews and the Romans who wanted it stopped by simply going to the tomb and taking out the body. They couldn't do it, yet Christianity erupted out of Jerusalem on an empirical claim that he had risen from the dead. Now, we don't have time to cover all that. I just want to give you an overview. I want to talk about, for me, the ones that convince me they're certainly telling the truth. And the one that convinces me the most are number 3 and number 4. And so I just want to spend a little bit of time on that. Embarrassing stories. What are embarrassing stories? Here's a principle that historians use when they're trying to discover whether a particular writer is telling the truth. It's called the principle of embarrassment, and it goes like this. If there's something embarrassing to the author or authors, it's probably true. Why would it be true? Yeah, because nobody's going to invent stories that embarrass themselves. They might invent stories that make them look good, but they won't invent stories that make them look bad. In fact, let me ask you guys a question in here. How many people in here have ever lied to make yourself look good? Look, if you don't have your hand up right now, you're lying to make yourself look good, and it's not working. We know you're lying. All right, how many people in here have ever lied to make yourself look bad? You might only do that if you're like a pool shark or something, right? But routinely, you're not going to lie to make yourself look bad or to embarrass yourself. You're going to lie to make yourself look good. Well, the New Testament writers, by the way, this is true of the Old Testament as well, but we're just concentrating on the New Testament. The New Testament writers have filled the New Testament with embarrassing stories that make them look bad. They never would have done this if they were making this up. That's why we call this the dove factor. In fact, let me just give you several examples of this. Notice the New Testament writers are dim-witted. How many times do they keep saying, we didn't know what he was saying. We didn't know what he was doing. We didn't know what his mission was. It's not until he's resurrected from the dead and ascended to heaven do they finally go, wow, I could have had a V8. Right? They don't get it. They're like in the dark most of the time when Jesus is going around when he's on the earth. Also, their biggest apostle, the leader of the apostles, of the disciples, is Peter. And at one point, Jesus turns to Peter and says, get behind me, Satan. Do you think Mark, who recorded that, at one point said, hey, Pete, I'm going to make this a real interesting story. I'm going to have the Lord call you Satan. What do you think Peter would have said? Have him call you Satan. I mean, this doesn't look good. I'm the leader here. This is embarrassing. And then Peter says, Lord, I'll never deny you. What does he wind up doing? He denies him 3 times. This is not invented. And then at the crucifixion, all the disciples, maybe with the exception of one, they all run away. This is like a Monty Python movie. Run away. They all run away. And who are the brave ones? The women. Ladies, you can give yourselves a hand. That's right. I am woman, hear me roar. I did not run away like you sissy pants men did. Now, who wrote the New Testament down? Men. Now, what man is going to invent that he was hiding for fear of the Jews while the women went down and discovered the empty tomb? Would any man in here invent that? Man, if I was making it up, I'd make myself look good. I'd write something down like this. Let's see, we marched right down there and we overpowered that elite Roman guard. Yeah, that sounds good. John said, get out. Peter roundhouse kicked him. Thomas said, we'll be back. No doubt. Some of you will get that tomorrow. And then we marched right down to the tomb on Sunday morning, and we saw Jesus, who congratulated us on our great faith. And then we went and comforted the trembling women. We'd never say it was Mr. Sissy Pants while the women went down to discover the empty tomb. Oh, by the way, why would you never say the women were the first witnesses in that culture? Because a woman's testimony was not considered on par with that of a man. So if you're making up the New Testament story, you'd only have the men be the first witnesses. Yet all four Gospels say the women were the first witnesses, which is telling us what? They really were. This is embarrassing, but they're all admitting it. I had a lady come up to me once, and she said, Frank, I know why Jesus appeared to the women first. I said, why? And she said, because he wanted to get the story out. I said, that is an excellent point. I had not thought of that. Because ladies, when your man comes home from work, does he say much? No. There could have been a nuclear explosion down at the plant. He's not going to tell you. You'll see it on the news before you hear it from him. You'll be watching the news going, hey, hon, what happened? Oh, yeah, I forgot to tell you. Yeah. The nuke blew up. I've been hot for 3 days. What's for dinner? I was at the University of Cincinnati a few months ago, and some guy came up to me and he said, you think that's bad? He said, my former business partner had his own private plane, and one day he was flying just with the pilot back home from a trip, and the pilot had a heart attack and died, and he didn't know how to fly the plane. So he got on the radio, and just like in the movies, they literally talked this guy down. When he got home, his wife said, honey, how was your day? Same old, same old. He just went to bed. I can't even believe this next verse is in the Bible, but it is. You know the end of the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus takes his disciples up on the hill and he's going to give them the Great Commission? This is the climax, right? Where Jesus says, go, therefore, make disciples of all nations. Notice he doesn't say make believers. There's a difference. Make disciples. Anyway, he says, make disciples of all nations. And lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age, right? He goes through all this. Baptize in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Well, it says right there in verse 17 about the disciples listening to Jesus giving them the Great Commission. Verse 17 says, some believed, but some doubted. What? He's standing resurrected right in front of them. It's like they're standing there going, you see that guy over there? Yep. That guy over there is Jesus. No, it can't be Jesus. He was just killed not long ago. No, I'm telling you, it's him. Look, Jesus is dead. The Romans killed him. It's him. Do you know what the Romans did to him? They whipped him brutally. They put nails in him. They put a spear in his side. Blood and water came out. He's dead. In fact, if he wasn't dead and the Romans let him live, they could have been killed. I'm telling you, Jesus is dead. I'm telling you, that's Jesus. It can't be Jesus. It is. How do you know? The women told me. They're not making this up. There's even potentially embarrassing details about Jesus in the text. For example, in Mark chapter 3, it says that Jesus' own family wanted to seize him and take him home because they thought he was out of his mind. They thought his own family thought he was nuts, in other words. Now, you may have heard the scholars say the New Testament writers invented Jesus to be God. Oh, really? Then why is Mark chapter 3 in there? Disparaging Jesus. His own family thinks he's nuts. In fact, his own brothers don't believe in him. That was embarrassing. We learn later, however, that Jesus' brother James, who wrote that little book in the New Testament called, and you guys are catching on, actually later dies as a martyr in the city of Jerusalem. He's thrown off the Temple Mount by the Sanhedrin, and then he's stoned to death. And this occurs in 62 AD, about 30 years after Jesus is alleged to have risen from the dead. No New Testament writer tells us this. You know who tells us this? Josephus, the Jewish historian who lived from 37 AD to about 100 AD and was probably in Jerusalem at the time. He tells us, and another writer who lived later, Hegesippus, they tell us that James dies as a martyr in the very city that Jesus is alleged to have risen from the dead in, and he's the pastor of the church in Jerusalem. When prior to Jesus resurrecting from the dead, James didn't think his brother was God. What changed James's mind that he becomes the pastor and then is martyred? That creed I mentioned earlier, 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3-7, in that creed, it tells who Jesus appeared to, resurrected, and one of the people he appeared to was James, Jesus' brother. So before the resurrection, James said to his brother, yo, bro, you ain't God. After the resurrection, James said, yo, bro, you're God. Now, how many people in here have a brother? All right, how many people have a brother who thinks he's God? Yeah, you don't believe in him either, do you? Neither did James. Jesus is called a drunkard. He's called a madman. He's called demon-possessed. Do you think they invented that? That some people are calling him demon-possessed. He has his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute, which easily could have been seen as a sexual advance. And oh, by the way, notice there are two prostitutes in Jesus' bloodline. The Messiah's bloodline, who are they? Rahab and Tamar. Now, do you think Matthew, when he wrote these genealogies down, said to himself, you know what, I really think I need to spice up the Messiah's bloodline a little bit. Let me put a couple of prostitutes in here. Let's see, Rahab, Tamar. No. That's embarrassing, but they're telling the truth. In fact, there's a lot of shady people in the Messiah's bloodline. Judah, from where we get the term Jew from, Jesus from the tribe of Judah. What did Judah do? Judah's the guy that sold Joseph into slavery in Egypt. He's also the guy that slept with his daughter-in-law, Tamar. And he didn't know she was his daughter-in-law, but nevertheless, he was a bad guy, and yet through him came the Messiah. David, a man after God's own heart. Yeah, but he's a liar, adulterer, and a murderer. Gee, I guess there's hope for the rest of us then. What do you think, huh? Bathsheba's in the bloodline. But you know, when Matthew gets to her in the genealogy, he won't mention her name. What does he say instead? Uriah's wife. He's telling the truth, but you notice it's a slam? Who was Uriah? Husband of Bathsheba, whom David had killed so he could cover up his sin with Bathsheba. Now, if you're making all this up, do you say stuff like this? Do you think a Pharaoh in Egypt would tolerate his historian saying, hey, Pharaoh, I'm going to put a couple of prostitutes in your bloodline. You're going to have a lot of shady people. No, the Pharaoh would say, off with your head. You don't find this in other ancient histories. You don't find all this embarrassing stuff. But you find it in both the Old and the New Testaments. Why? Because they're telling the truth. From other civilizations at the time, they brag about their victories and they never tell about their defeats. But you look in the Bible, you're getting warts and all. In fact, Dennis Prager, some of you may know who Dennis Prager is. He's a conservative Jewish man who has a radio program. He has PragerU. He writes a lot, has columns and all this. And he says, I believe in the Old Testament primarily because nobody would invent a history about themselves like the Jews. And I agree, but I would also say, Dennis, if embarrassing testimony works for the Old Testament, why doesn't it work for the New? Who would invent all these embarrassing New Testament details? Nobody. They're not invented. They're telling the truth. And then Jesus is hung on a tree, which according to Deuteronomy 21:23, anyone who's hung on a tree is under God's curse. So if you're trying to invent a Messiah to the Jews, you'd never hang him on a tree because that man is under God's curse. Well, he was under God's curse. What curse? The curse of sin that we put him under. By the way, what are the two trees you see in the book of Genesis, the beginning of Genesis? What are the two trees? Anyone? Tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Fast forward all the way to the end of the Bible. The Bible is very symmetrical. What tree do you find? The tree of life. Do you know there's a tree in the middle? It's the tree they hung Jesus on. Because we sinned at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the only way we were going to have access again to the tree of life is if Jesus takes our punishment on himself by being hung on a tree. But if you were making this up to the Jews, you would never say this. Yet it says it. Because that's what happened. There's a lot more on embarrassing stories. You can get the book, but we got to move on to the next one, and that is excruciating deaths. And this is the argument that says these men who were in a position to know whether Jesus had resurrected from the dead or not died excruciating deaths when they could have saved themselves by saying, look, it never happened. By the word, excruciating means out of the crucifixion. That's where we get the word from. And this is a painting of Peter being crucified upside down. We're not exactly sure he was crucified upside down, but we do know he was martyred. There's ancient historians who mention this. Peter himself was killed, so was Paul, so was James. We have good evidence. In fact, we have really good evidence that 4 of the disciples were martyred. Paul, Peter, and the 2 Jameses, okay? We have some evidence that others were martyred, but you know what we don't have from the ancient world? We don't have anyone ever claiming that any of the apostles recanted. Wonder why that is. Because they really witnessed what happened. Now, it's really important that when you think about this, that you realize that all of the New Testament writers, with the exception of Luke, all of the New Testament writers were Jews who thought they were God's chosen people. And there were a couple of things they didn't think would happen. They didn't think a man could claim to be God. That was blasphemy. And they didn't think that a man would resurrect in the middle of time. They knew that everyone would be resurrected at the end of time, according to Isaiah and Daniel. But they didn't think one guy would claim to be God and be resurrected in the middle of time. Yet, that's exactly what they wrote happened. Why did they write that? Why would they do this if it didn't happen? Why would they invent it? Remember, they're all believers in Yahweh. In fact, it's really important to look at the apostles' beliefs and practices before and after the resurrection. So you can see the drastic transformation that took place virtually overnight to these pious Jews who thought they were God's chosen people. Before, they believed in animal sacrifice. After, they said Christ's sacrifice is enough. You know, they've been slaying lambs and other animals to Yahweh for thousands of years. And then suddenly, or at least hundreds of years, and then suddenly Jesus comes along and they say, you know, we don't need to slay these lambs anymore because these lambs are just symbols of the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Here he is. Before, they believed in the binding law of Moses. Afterwards, they say Christ's life has fulfilled the binding law of Moses. Before, they believed in strict monotheism. Afterwards, they believed in a Trinity, 3 persons in one divine essence. Yes, I know the Trinity is hinted at in the Old Testament, but it's much clearer in the New. Before, they believed in the Sabbath. In fact, they thought they could be stoned for not obeying the Sabbath. After, they're worshiping on Sunday. And Paul in Colossians 2 even says, don't let anyone tell you you'll have to obey any Sabbath or festival day. Why? Why don't you have to obey the Sabbath anymore? Because the Sabbath has arrived. Jesus is our rest. We rest in him. In fact, out of the 10 commandments, 9 of them are repeated in the New Testament. The only one that isn't is keep holy the Sabbath. Now, this doesn't mean, it's not saying it's not a good idea to take a day off or to rest or to, worship the Lord in a gathering. That's not what I'm pointing out here. I'm simply pointing out that these Jews did away with the Sabbath and put their gathering day on the day he rose, Sunday. Before, they believed in a conquering Messiah. Afterwards, they believed in a sacrificial Messiah. Before, they believed in circumcision. Afterwards, they believed in baptism and communion. And let me ask you one other thing, ladies and gentlemen. What people group is ever going to invent this as their sign? You want to join our club? Yeah, what do I need to do? What? Pass. Nobody's going to invent that. In fact, Milton Berle once had a joke. He said, here's the missing verse in the Bible. Abraham looking at God going, okay, God, let me get this straight. The Arabs get all the oil and we get to do what to our what? Nobody's inventing this. Now, also, if you think about this, just thought of this. Do people really think that the Jews invented all this stuff for some kind of entertainment purpose? Do you think this is an historical novel of some kind? You ever tried to read Leviticus? Really? How about all the genealogies? Why are they writing all that stuff? For fun? No, because this is really what happened. And they're tracing the Messiah's bloodline. Now, what would have caused these pious Jews who thought they were God's chosen people to abandon all these long-held beliefs for these new beliefs virtually overnight? The only thing I can think of is what psychologists call an impact event. What's an impact event? An impact event is an event that occurs in your life that is so impactful, so dramatic, that despite the fact that you might not remember what you had for breakfast this morning, you'll remember the details of an impact event that occurred 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago if you're old enough. That's how dramatic these events were. In fact, there's probably only a few of you in here that can answer this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. If you can remember where you were and what you were doing November 22nd, 1963, raise your hand, please, and hold it up high. Ladies and gentlemen, you see these people with their hands up? These people are very old. November 22nd, 1963 is my earliest memory. Yes, I'm 62 years old now. I know, I don't look a day over 61. Actually, when I turned 50, my wife was very encouraging. She said, honey, you're going to live to be 100. I said, how do you know? She said, because you look half dead already. November 22nd, 1963, I'm 2 years old. I'm 2 years old in 2 days. I'm a toddler. I'm standing in our living room in Wanamassett, New Jersey, and my mother is sitting on an ottoman in front of a black and white TV, weeping uncontrollably. Mommy, what's the matter? What's the matter? They killed the president. They killed the president. President Kennedy assassinated that day. I can still see my mother right now in my mind, sitting on that ottoman, weeping because I had never seen her cry before. It was an impact event. I can see her right now when she was 26. She's 86 right now, but I can see her when she was 26. That's my earliest memory. I don't remember anything before that and very little after that. Where were you when the second plane hit the tower? I was in my office at my home in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I had the TV on behind me. I'd seen the first tower had been hit. I didn't know by what. And I was talking to a pastor on the north side of town, and we were talking about what topic I would talk about when I came to speak at his church. And I said, do you have the TV on? He goes, yeah. I said, maybe a Cessna hit the World Trade Tower. I mean, that happened before. And so we're talking, my back's still to the TV, and suddenly he yells into the phone. He goes, the second tower just got hit. I turned around and looked at the TV. The second tower's on fire. I said, was it a Cessna? He goes, no, it was a big plane. It was a passenger plane. It looked like a United plane. I said, you saw that? He said it was just on live TV. I said, look, let me call you back. I hung up the phone. And for some reason that morning I had CNN on. The Communist News Network. And I'm not making this up, but the commentator on CNN literally said, one has to think there's some sort of navigational error here. He said, navigational error? This is the clearest day in the history of the Big Apple. What do you think, the pilots can't see where they're going? I mean, you think Stevie Wonder's flying these planes? Come on, this is terrorism. I called that pastor the next day. I said, we're going to come to your church and talk about Islam because that's what this is related to. Now, 9/11 was over 22 years ago. But those of you who are old enough can remember something about that day because it was an impact event. But if I were to ask you where you were 22 days ago, most of you are going to go, I don't know, let me look at my iPhone. What was I doing that day? I don't know. For some of you, if I were to ask you where you were 22 hours ago, you'd go. Why can you remember something from 22 years ago but not 22 days ago? No impact event 22 days ago, impact event 22 years ago. Do you think a resurrection would have been an impact event? Do you think if Jesus really did walk out of that tomb after being surely murdered, and then he performed miracles for them, and they touched him, they ate with him over a period of 40 days, do you think they would have remembered everything that he said and did? Do you think they would have had any trouble figuring out what to write down when they wrote it down later? No, these memories were engraved in their minds. It was an impact event. I hear skeptics like Bart Ehrman at UNC Chapel Hill, he'll give examples like, well, can you remember the State of the Union from George Bush in 2005? Well, of course I can't. Why? Because it wasn't an impact event. But I can remember George Bush holding up a police badge 9 days after 9/11, practically crying on TV, because that was an impact event. And when you have an impact event, you don't forget it. And when somebody rises from the dead, you're not going to have any trouble remembering what happened. And how could they remember what Jesus said? By the way, do you think when Jesus gave a sermon, he only gave it once? If these guys are traveling with him for 3 years, do you think they heard the same thing over and over again? Of course they did. They'd had no trouble remembering what he said. You don't even need the Holy Spirit inspiration to know that. If you traveled with me for 3 years, you'd go, here comes the joke. In fact, the video guy that travels with me, we go to college campuses, if I go down, he can do it. He doesn't need me. See, this is the only way I could figure out why they would have abandoned everything on the left here and adopted everything on the right virtually overnight. In fact, what did the New Testament writers have to gain by making up a new religion? Remember, they're believers in Yahweh. They already think they're God's chosen people. What did they get by saying Jesus had resurrected from the dead? Claimed to be God and resurrected from the dead. Well, first they got kicked out of the synagogue, and then they got beaten, tortured, and killed. Last time I checked, that was not a list of perks. We're going to start a new religion. We are? Yeah. What's it going to get us? First we get kicked out of the synagogue, then we'll get beaten, tortured, and killed. Well, sign me up. What a great idea. Why haven't we thought of this earlier? No, they're not inventing this. In fact, I sometimes get the question, if you're a Christian, you might get the question too. Are there any non-Christian writers that talk about Jesus and the apostles? I mentioned them briefly earlier. Yes, they're out there. They're not eyewitnesses. But when you take their brief references to Jesus and the apostles and line them all up, you get a story congruent with the New Testament. But you know what's under that question? Are there any non-Christian writers that talk about Jesus and the apostles? Is what I believe is a very illicit assumption. What's the illicit assumption? These people are trying to say, you really can't trust the New Testament writers because you see, they were biased. You can only trust the non-Christian writers. Now, if you think about this for more than 5 seconds, you should realize how stupid that assessment is. What did these people have to gain by saying it was true? They had everything to lose. Yeah, if it's true. But if it's not true, is what I'm saying. What did they have to gain by making it up? Look, they had every motive to say the resurrection did not happen. Not every motive to say it did, given from where they came from. In fact, some of you may know my friend J. Warner Wallace. I don't know if you know this guy. He's a cold case homicide detective who's been on Dateline more than any other homicide detective because he solves murders that are decades old. Jim is also a Christian, and he took his homicide detective skills and applied them to the greatest homicide of all time, the homicide of Jesus. So he has a website called coldcasechristianity.com. He's written several books. And what Jim says is, in fact, probably his best one is Cold Case Christianity. What Jim says is anytime he finds a body that's been murdered, he knows there's only 3 reasons or a combination of these 3 reasons why that guy's been murdered. He says, look, I don't need to hunt down 1,000 different motivations. That guy was murdered for one or more of these 3 reasons. There was either a sex issue, a money issue, or a power issue. Sex, money, or power. Those are the 3 things that can motivate people to murder. By the way, they're the same 3 things that can motivate any of us to sin. Why? Because sex, money, and power are good things. In fact, they're so good, we'll often take shortcuts to get them. And what Jim is saying, he's saying if you're trying to say that the New Testament writers invented all this, you've got to find one or more of those 3 motivators. Otherwise, they're never going to invent it. So let's go through the 3 motivators. Ladies and gentlemen, did the New Testament writers suddenly get real popular with the ladies for saying Jesus had resurrected from the dead? No, they didn't get sex. Did they get money? No, they weren't 21st century prosperity gospel preachers. Did I strike a nerve? Can I say something about that briefly? You know, I'm kind of shy about my opinions. The easiest way to show the prosperity gospel is nonsense, other than reading the scriptures, is to just look at one fact. Jesus and the apostles weren't healthy and wealthy. They were martyred. Don't tell me they didn't have enough faith. Come on. In fact, Jesus said that if they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you. He said, you're going to have trouble in this world, but take heart, I've overcome the world. Paul said anyone who lives a faithful life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Guess what? You're promised persecution, not health and wealth. So don't buy into this nonsense that the reason you're not healthy and wealthy is because you don't have enough faith. First of all, I would argue that everyone in this room is wealthy by the world standards. But that philosophy is just absolute nonsense, that theology, and it's pulling people away from the truth. Because when it doesn't work for them, people go, oh, I guess God doesn't exist. Yeah, you got the wrong God. You're praying to the Candyman God. Our God came into this world and put himself on the cross to save you, not to give you a new Cadillac. So no, they weren't 21st century prosperity gospel preachers. They didn't get money. Did they get power? No, they got the opposite. They were persecuted. Paul had power when he was Saul persecuting the church. As soon as he becomes a Christian, he's the one persecuted. Look, they didn't get sex. They didn't get money. They didn't get power. They're not inventing this. They're telling the truth. And then you can ask the question, why would they die for a known lie? You might at this point, you say, wait a minute, Frank, time out. If you're going to say that martyrdom is evidence for Christianity, don't you have to say that martyrdom is evidence for Islam? No. Why? Because there's a lot of differences between the Muslim martyrs of today and the New Testament martyrs of New Testament times. But let me give you one major difference for our purposes here. The Muslim martyrs haven't witnessed anything that tells them that Islam is true. They just have faith. The New Testament martyrs, on the other hand, witnessed Jesus risen. They saw Jesus. They touched Jesus. They ate with Jesus. They verified with their own senses that Jesus had risen from the dead. Some people will die for a lie they think is the truth. No one will die for a lie they know is a lie. And the New Testament writers were in a position to know whether it was a lie or not, and they went to their deaths anyway. You can't get that. You can't get any better evidence than that unless you were there yourself. And, you know, I need to admit this. I'm glad I wasn't there. Why? Because I probably would have been one of the ones putting him on the cross. Wouldn't you? Oh, yeah, you claim to be God. Why don't you come down from that cross? Now, last thing I'm going to say on this is going to sound like heresy for just a minute, but it's not. Stick with me. Christianity is not true because a series of documents we put under one binding we call the Bible says it's true. In fact, Christianity would be true if the Bible never existed. You say, how can that be? Do you realize there were thousands of Christians before a line of the New Testament was ever written? Why? Because they witnessed the resurrected Jesus. They didn't read about it in a book. You see, Christianity did not begin with a book. Christianity began with an event, the resurrection. There would be no books or documents written down by Jews in the first century claiming a man claimed to be God and rose from the dead, and then those people going and dying for that claim, unless a man really did claim to be God and really did rise from the dead. Why would they do this otherwise? There's no motive. In fact, we could put it this way. The New Testament writers did not create the resurrection. The resurrection created the New Testament writers. You wouldn't have these documents written by Jews in the first century unless it really happened. And the evidence shows it really happened. Now, thankfully, they did write it down so we could know about it and orient our lives according to it, but had they never written it down, it still would have been true. We just wouldn't have known much about it. Do you see the point? So there's a lot more in the books, but we don't have time to cover it all. Let's cover the overall argument. Does truth exist? Yes. If somebody says there's no truth, you're going to ask, is that, this is known as review, okay? If somebody says there is no truth, you're going to say, is that true? You're going to turn the claim on itself. Does God exist? First argument. Cosmological. Second argument. Teleological or design argument. Third argument. Moral argument. From those three arguments, we get a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, moral, personal, intelligent creator who created and sustains all things. Are miracles possible? What's the greatest miracle in the Bible? Creation. Genesis 1:1. If that verse is true, every other verse is believable, and even atheists are admitting the evidence for the first verse. Did Jesus rise from the dead? Yes, it appears he did. And if he is God, if he's risen from the dead, then he's God, and whatever God teaches is true. And when you get into the book, you'll see Jesus taught the Old Testament as the Word of God, and he promised the New Testament. Now, take out your phone and shoot this QR code, because I'm going to send you the entire PowerPoint presentation. Actually, even the slides I can't send you, or I didn't show you, I'm going to send to you in a PDF format, and I'm going to send about 8 or 9 other presentations, including one I'm doing tomorrow, by just clicking on that and following the cues. Now, there are books and DVDs back there, and we may be sold out from some of them, but you can check out. These are some of them. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, stealing from God. This is a DVD set that you can get that goes through everything we've done over about 7 hours. We're now teaching online courses, and I teach some of them. J. Warner Wallace, Elisa Childers. You've had Scott Klusendorf here. He teaches some for us. Gary Habermas teaches a class for us. We've got about 30 different classes you can take online. So if you want to check that out, go to crossexamine.org. We're on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. In fact, we're so into YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, we've actually combined these three into one social media platform. We call it YouTwitface. Have you signed up for YouTwitface yet? It's kind of a Jersey thing. Actually, we're also on Instagram and TikTok as well. Don't forget about the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast. Wherever you get podcasts, you'll find this, and there's 2 a week. Also, we're on TV Wednesday nights here. It'd be 6 p.m. I mentioned Roku, or you can go to our website and listen to it. And if you don't do anything else, at least download the Cross-Examined app. 2 words in the App Store, Cross-Examine. It's got the podcast on it. It's got the TV show streaming on it. It even has a quick answer section. So you might be having lunch with somebody, and they say something that's wrong about Christianity, and you don't know how to answer it. All you need to do is take out your iPhone or your Droid and go, hey, hang on, I'm getting a text. Hey, what about this? Got the answer right there. See, we make this easy for you, all right? All right, last thing before your questions. It's true. The question is, so what? So what if it's true? Well, let's take a very sobering look at reality here. Do you realize that everyone you love will die? Everything you build will crumble. Everything you say will be forgotten. Everything you do will come to nothing. You and your identity will die and vanish unless God exists. So the best news of all is that God does exist, and he actually did die for you. Now, when I was in the Navy, I was in naval aviation, and we had to earn golden wings, which were fairly hard to earn, but there's nothing more difficult in the Navy to earn than a golden trident. That's what the SEALs wear. Very few people that start SEAL training make it through, maybe 5%. Those that do make it through wear that trident with pride. It is their identity. When Michael Monsoor was buried in Rosecrans Cemetery in San Diego, California, just about every Navy SEAL showed up for his funeral. And when they passed his casket, they took off their tridents and they pressed them into his casket. They took their identity and put their identity in the one that died for them, the one that sacrificed for them. That's what we're supposed to do. But our culture says, oh, no, don't put your identity in Jesus. Put your identity in your sexual preference. Or put your identity in your gender. Or put your identity in your job. Or your party, your political party, or even another person. Do you realize, ladies and gentlemen, that none of those things are ultimate? That you can lose all those things? I mean, if you put your identity in your sexual preference, what happens when you can no longer sexually perform? You no longer have an identity? Or what happens when you're no longer sexually preferred? You no longer have an identity? If you put your identity in your job, what happens when you lose your job? You no longer have an identity, or you retire? If you put your identity in another person, what happens when that person, God forbid, dies or leaves you? You no longer have an identity? There's only one way to get a secure, eternal, God-given identity that you can't lose. You're to put your identity in Jesus. Do you realize that Christianity is the only worldview where you don't achieve your identity, you receive your identity? It's offered to you as a gift. You don't achieve it. You simply receive it. There's no competition here. If you have to achieve your identity, well, all the pressure's on you, and there's always somebody that can do it better. No, you simply receive it. This is why John, who wrote the Gospel of John, a biography of John, says in the very first chapter that he has given you the right to become a child of God. As soon as you repent and you accept what he's done for you, you have a secure identity. And that identity is actually going to result in your resurrection forever on a new heaven and a new earth. Yet our world is trying to keep you from that. There's a lady that's a very good friend of ours. She's 70 years old. She works in Starbucks, not for the money, but for the ministry. And there are some young girls trying to transition in her Starbucks. And she says sometimes they sit in the back on their break and they flip through TikTok video after TikTok video or Reddit entry after Reddit entry, trying to get reassurance that what they're doing is true and good. Because in their hearts, they know it's not the solution, but they have to be continually affirmed by what's going on. And my friend says to them, I graduated high school over 50 years ago, and I'm still paying for some of the decisions I made. But what you're doing is irreversible. You don't think you want children now? What happens when you're 25 and you do? And she is so good with these young girls that some of them want to have Bible study with her now. Because she knows where true identity comes from. It's secure. You don't work for it, which means you can't lose it. He's already secured it for you. So as our world struggles with identity, as our world is confused, that doesn't mean you need to be confused. You know what the right answer is. So accept that answer and then tell it to other folks. Know God and make him known. That's why we're here. Make sense? All right.